Today we chat with Jan-Werner Müller, professor at Princeton University of Political Science, to discuss some topics related with his field of work, that is constitutional patriotism and populism. Good afternoon, Professor Müller. Thank you for attending us. You locate the origin of constitutional patriotism in the reflections that Karl Jaspers did at the end of Second World War about the concept of guilt. So our first question is, what has to do a personal emotion, a sentiment, with a political stance?
So allow me to say two things. One is that constitutional patriotism, like all concepts, has a particular history. And one of the things I was trying to do in the book on constitutional patriotism was to trace that particular history in post-war Germany. Unlike what is sometimes said, it didn't just begin with Jürgen Habermas's important contributions. It has a longer history for different theorists thinking about it. It came with different philosophical background assumptions. So not everybody shared, for instance, Habermas's philosophical apparatus. One of the other important people in this context, a man called Dolf Sternberger, was much more of an Aristotelian, for instance. So why is this important? Well, it's important for two reasons. One is that, yes, of course, you can always demonstrate that something has a more particular history than it might appear to be the case initially. But that's not in and of itself a normative argument. That doesn't discredit the concept as such, and we can't expect sort of concepts to come down to us in a pristine form from some kind of abstract universalist heaven. But more interestingly, maybe for our day, it also shows that it's a relatively flexible concept. So it's not the case that you have to buy into sort of very thick background assumptions from any particular political theory, or let's say a larger kind of philosophy. If I'm allowed to mix theories for a second, you could say that it could be subject to a kind of overlapping consensus among quite different traditions, people coming with quite different background assumptions. Now, I realize that nothing of what I've said so far has actually really answered your question. So one word on the whole issue of emotions. This, of course, if I may say so, is partly related to a long-standing suspicion that, as critics have long put it, this is somehow a dry, abstract, too rational.
We will come back to this point.
Also, it's very typical and I think very inappropriate as a word in this context. It's supposed to be a bloodless concept. So, you know, some people seem to like their concepts with as much blood as possible. So yeah, that's been a long-standing critique. But I think the critique is mistaken for two reasons. One is that the whole idea that you couldn't possibly have a more interesting mixture of, let's say, emotions on the one hand, or even passions, and reasons, I think is often blocked by people then saying, oh, these are sort of completely separate worlds. And once you've opted for this supposedly abstract rationalistic concepts, sort of emotions are out of the window. But and maybe this foreshadows a later discussion for us today as well. Conversely, sometimes people say, oh, you know, something like populism, that's all emotion. And that's sort of in and of itself dangerous and maybe poses particular problems for democracy. And I think what is often not understood, even though it's basically a point we have known about since Aristotle actually, is that, of course, that separation in many ways is implausible, is flawed. Emotions do have what, for instance, Jon Elster calls cognitive antecedents. So people don't just get up in the morning and are angry out of nothing, as if, you know, a sort of passion overcomes them that is completely inexplicable. I mean, you have reasons why you feel certain certain things. So just to go with one example that's very prominent in the whole damn discussion about populism, if we think about anger, it's very clear that people are angry for particular reasons. They might have a sense that society is unfair, they aren't being treated with dignity, all kinds of things could be in play. But if we kind of have this rigid separation of emotions and reasons, we don't even get to the point of asking them what their particular reasons might be. And the same story, I think, can be told about constitutional patriotism, that it's important to get the reasons right. But once you are committed to the right kinds of, I would say, universalist principles about, let's say, freedom and equality, there's no problem with then, in a sense, feeling strongly about them and being animated to fight for them in certain ways, to feel passionate about them, to launch passionate appeals to other people. I mean, I feel that what I'm saying is actually pretty trivial, but these are points which are often completely missed, either by the, I think, very superficial critique that, oh, constitutional patriotism is so abstract, but equally, they're sort of missed by people who say, oh, populism is dangerous because inherently it's sort of emotional, and ideally we banish all emotions from politics.
So let me then change a bit the order of the questions and introduce a further critique. For example, as one of the most common objections, as you say, is that constitutional patriotism is just appealing to philosophers, that is too abstract, too cold. For example, Mauricio Viroli, who also has worked in distinguishing nationalism from another kind of political identity, claims that with his proposal, Habermas, we will come back to Habermas in a minute, he uses this example. He says that Habermas took a good glass of wine, of Barolo, I think that he put it, and to take away all its flavor, all its color, and to transform it into a glass of water. And Barolo continues, a glass of water doesn't harm anybody, but also doesn't motivate or inspires political action. So I guess that I can anticipate your take on this kind of criticism.
So, as I hope I'm allowed to say this, my former dear colleague Maurizio Viroli is, of course, a great connoisseur of wine. So it really matters, you know, what kind of label he chose and what he was pointing to. But with all due respect, I think the story again is a tiny bit flawed to say the least. First of all, whether water really tastes like something or is important is obviously very context dependent. I mean, under some circumstances, actually damn important. Plus, there are questions of taste as well, which is why some people spend a lot of money on, you know, let's say Evian as opposed to just drinking from the tap. I mean, this is just by the by, but I think from the get-go, I'm not sure how far we can get with that particular analogy. But I would basically try to re-articulate the point I was trying to make earlier, that the whole division between water and wine in this context, in this theoretical context, is not really working to begin with. And if we wanted to run further with the analogy, of course, we could get into the problem of if you get drunk on wine, what could happen, and so on. But I'm not sure how fruitful that ultimately is. It easily gets us into, I think, in and of themselves, actually, strangely abstract discussions where people do end up saying, oh, but nationalism is so much more passionate. But this in and of itself is actually a very abstract kind of claim. And you do need to tell more particular stories. And, you know, I think all that theory can really do here is to sort of give us some indications of how in our collective public conversations we might sort of think about the right starting point. And there I think it does matter whether you start with political principles or whether you start, for instance, with some conception of a more or less shared, let's say more or less homogeneous national culture. So I'm not saying that theory doesn't matter. At the same time, theory can only tell us so much. And I'm a little bit wary of these sort of sometimes sort of amateur psychological assumptions, sort of collective psychology, when, for instance, people also say, oh, you know, if we, the supposedly good philosophers, sort of don't fill this vacuum because everybody wants emotions and you need, you know, to give people something by way of passions. If we don't do it, you know, bad people will do it, you know, racists will do it, or the far right will do it, or whatever. And again, that's not completely wrong in many contexts, but it's also not a truly sort of theoretical position, nor is it empirically all that plausible in all kinds of ways. So I would generally maybe underline, and maybe this will disappoint some of your viewers, that constitutional patriotism is more, it's a more substantive proposition than sometimes said. It's not just, oh, let's take, you know, Habermas's sort of most abstract thought and then sort of put it in front of people and say, now this is what you have to believe. It's more substantive than that. On the other hand, though, it's a fairly modest proposal as a political theory. There are many questions which it doesn't answer. There are many things which are very context dependent. So I, of course, do think it's important to articulate it. I think it can play a very useful role in liberal democracies. But those who might find the idea attractive, I think also should be conscious of the limits and be clear that there are many things it doesn't answer. There are many things it cannot really specify ex ante. So like so many other things, it's obviously not any kind of panacea.
Okay, so we are talking about why constitutional patriotism has not this kind of or that kind of problem. Let's now say something about what is constitutional patriotism. There was a name that you mentioned, also the political scientist Dolf Stenberg. We owe the term constitutional patriotism, well, in German, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it. He was the one to first coin the term. What was the meaning that he gave to it, that we know that is not the exact same meaning that Habermas gave to it, and that nowadays is most extended. So what was Dolf Stenberg's take on constitutional patriotism?
So like Habermas, actually, he was confronted with a situation where because of history, the notion of the nation had become deeply problematic. He, of course, also was living in what was seen at the time as a divided nation state. And he encouraged fellow citizens to commit to the Constitution as a point of identification, as a point of valorizing the polity, not the Constitution, I hasten to add, as in every single paragraph, which again is, I think, is a sort of common misunderstanding that you now have to kind of affirm or have a cult of the Constitution as sort of the actual existing document. He was talking about basic principles as they were formulated in the post-war period in the basic law. And again, this has a very particular origins. Habermas then also deployed this notion in yet a slightly different context in the 1980s, when he was opposing intellectuals who, in his view, were kind of trying to normalize the nation again, were also trying to normalize the German past in all kinds of ways. He sort of thought there was a certain attempt to establish a new kind of cultural hegemony that was much more right-wing, much more conservative. And he sort of adopted constitutional patriotism as one concept that could be deployed to resist what he saw as an attempt to kind of move on all kinds of fronts by the right, by conservatives. And again, all of that is not trivial. It's helpful to know that history, but the concept isn't in a sense bound to that particular history. And something that I think at the time it's fair to say was at best sort of in the background, was not much discussed, and one can certainly criticize the fact that it wasn't discussed more, but something or two areas where initially, as far as I know, the concept didn't really have much application, have become much more important. And what I'm talking about, you won't be surprised to hear, is of course, first of all, questions about borders, about immigration, about what you have to commit to become a citizen, and so on. And secondly, the whole question of how nation states relate to the European Union. That sort of, as we all know, became much more prominent in the course of the 1990s. Arguably, certainly in a country like Germany, it should have been, especially questions of immigration. You remember that for a long time, the German government explicitly said, we're not a country of immigration. This is sort of, maybe an American problem, Canadian problem, whatever. Multiculturalism, these are very strange things, with which we have nothing to do. Basically, purposefully ignoring the fact that, of course, plenty of people had come from, including from Spain, from Turkey, from Italy, from all kinds of places. And unlike what was initially said, they weren't all going to turn around and as the phrase goes, go back to their countries. So all I'm saying again is that it's a concept that will not answer all questions, but it does have a certain flexibility. And if questions about belonging come up, if questions about how to relate to supranational entities come up, then this is a kind of conceptual offering, a kind of normative offering, if you like, that I think a lot of people have found attractive, and that also people have found is possible to detach from the initial historical context of the 1970s and 1980s.
One of the most common objections, especially here in Spain, that, as you know, in the early 2000s, the concept was very popular, was adopted both from the right and the left. It says that constitutional patriotism is at the end just another form, if you want, a very sophisticated, very well articulated form of civic or the so-called liberal nationalism. And the main line of reasoning says that constitutional patriotism is not truly a post-national identity, as some may argue, because, and to quote one of your papers, the we of constitutional patriots appears not to be in question. What's your take on this issue? Do you agree with this kind with those critics? Is constitutional patriotism just another form of national liberalism, the kind of theory that David Miller or Yael Tamir has proposed in the early 90s?
Again, allow me to give you a twofold answer. So I realize that when one looks at the end results of theorizing, certain versions of civic nationalism and constitutional patriotism can look very similar. But at the risk of sounding a little bit apodictic, it still matters where you start. And at least in my understanding, nationalism is going to start with some story about culture. And in the case of David Miller, that's very clear. He doesn't try to hide that fact. And then he, of course, sort of generates a lot of normative arguments from that starting point. But it's still a very different kind of theory, ultimately, than constitutional patriotism, which in a sense might start with something, again, at the risk of invoking this cliche, more abstract, and then can also end up with something fairly particular, because of course it needs to bring in particular histories. We already talked about how emotions, passions are not a taboo for it, and so on. So the endpoints can look similar, but the fact that the starting points are different for me still matters. And to the extent that we want to sort of seriously think through this, I think you kind of have to decide what your starting point ultimately is. And my suspicion is simply that if you start with culture in a certain way, you are more likely to end up with conclusions that tend towards the more, let's say, exclusionary of one sort or another. So that's one part of the answer. The other one is that, yes, I would concede to the critics that constitutional patriotism in and of itself certainly does not give an answer to what in democratic theory is generally known as the boundary problem, or what is often known as a kind of deep paradox, that
could you say something?
The citizens themselves should decide who the people are, but for them to decide, of course, you already have to know who the citizens and who the people really are. So in that sense, I would reiterate also the point that this is not a theory that gives you answers to everything. Trouble, of course, with the boundary problem is it's not like we have 10 other great answers. Many of our colleagues, I think, would say, actually, we don't have any real answer. But then again, even that conclusion might not be completely trivial, because if you start out with constitutional patriotism, in my view at least, but of course I cannot guarantee this in any shape or form, you are somewhat more likely to end up maybe with porous borders, with more inclusionary forms of politics. Not guaranteed. I mean, we can think of historical examples where a commitment to political principles can also turn very exclusionary in certain ways. So McCarthyism is an obvious example where, our free world ends up generating loyalty oaths and can be highly intolerant in many ways. So I'm not saying it's guaranteed or you will necessarily end up in that place, but in terms of your basic theoretical commitments, I think it gets us more likely to one place than to another.
Great. So let's leave for now the question of constitutional patriotism and touch a bit on another of your topics of research, populism. The concept of populism is highly controversial. Some claim that is a political strategy. Others view it as a political style. The most popular approach sees as a kind of discourse, and there are other authors who completely reject the concept and suggest that it's not useful, it's a pseudo concept. And so you disagree with them, you claim that is a useful concept of analysis, that we should try to understand it, and you propose the following definition. You see populism as a moralistic imagination of politics. What does that mean? What is a moralistic imagination of politics?
So it's part of it, but this is not really sort of the crucial part. And beyond that, at the risk of sounding a bit pedantic, I don't actually so much sort of offer a singular definition as a kind of story about certain family resemblances, so that, you know, we're trying to sort of understand a phenomenon, or if you prefer that language, which is a bit different but not that different, a sort of Weberian ideal type. So to kind of make sense of our political reality, we're kind of trying to understand what a particular formation might be about, what the relevant similarities might be to others. And in that context, what I've been trying to put forward is the idea that, contrary to what is very often said, what matters about populism is not so much criticism of elites, as the sort of somewhat cliched phrase goes. In fact, you know, criticizing the powerful, keeping a close eye on the powerful, can be a good democratic virtue, and is actually not something that we should, you know, automatically be worried about in the way that some people, at least, are automatically nowadays worried about populism. So it's true, of course, that when populist politicians are in opposition, they criticize existing governments, they criticize other parties, they criticize elites in some sense. But more important, they end up claiming that they, and only they, that's crucial, only they represent what they consider to be, it's a very typical phrase, the real people, or also the silent majority. And that is a kind of moral claim to a monopoly of representing the supposedly real people. And that, if I may add, immediately has two consequences for democracy, both of which I think are dangerous. One, and that's pretty obvious, politicians of this type are going to claim that all other contenders for power are fundamentally illegitimate. That's not just normal criticism. I mean, all politicians will criticize, you know, their rivals. I mean, that's completely normal, ideally even productive in a democracy, as long as it is about policies, or it can even be about values. So it's okay to, you know, bring in morality in this way. I'm not saying that we need to kind of ban morality from our politics, but what populists sort of end up doing for the most part is what, you know, maybe most prominently in our epoch, in our era recently, Trump did in 2016. So he simply said, my rival is just a corrupt, crooked character who doesn't work for the people. I mean, Trump was extreme in this regard, but he was not truly an exception. So that's one consequence. The other one is maybe less obvious, namely that populists are also going to claim that all those among the people themselves, all citizens who do not share their understanding of the supposedly real people, or who disagree with them on some sort, on some issue or another, that with all these people you can basically put into question whether they truly belong to the people at all. So long story short, what I would like to emphasize is that what matters about populism, what is dangerous about populism, is not anti-elitism. Because obviously if you think that, you end up potentially discrediting a lot of entirely legitimate critical discourse in a democracy. The problem is really anti-pluralism, the tendency always fundamentally to exclude others. Again, not just criticizing others, that's obviously completely normal in a democracy, but to basically reduce political questions to questions of belonging. So if I may, just to underline the point, bring in Trump one more time, very often he and his acolytes didn't respond to criticism by saying, look, that's why the critics are wrong. This is why we as the government are doing the right thing. See, the answer was often simply, the critics are un-American. And that's a very particular kind of move. And that in and of itself is, to put it very politely, not helpful for a democracy.
Another common concept related with populism is that of illiberal democracy that was coined in the 90s by the journalist Fareed Zakaria. At first glance, it seems a useful tool to describe some kind of regime where regular elections happen, but that nonetheless seem to lack in the common constitutional guarantees, or that are also lacking in the rights and liberties department. You don't nonetheless reject the convenience of using this term. You say that Orban's country is not an illiberal democracy, it's another thing. Could you explain why you reject this very popular and at first glance useful concept?
So to clarify, I'm not claiming that democracy and liberalism are the same thing. I mean, some of our colleagues, I think, would go quite far in claiming that actually no, there is no possible tension. You know, these things are always perfectly compatible and so on. I wouldn't say that. I mean, this remains an important distinction, but I think it can also be misconstrued, misunderstood, and it can certainly be instrumentalized in nefarious ways by, especially but not only, far-right populist politicians. Because if you open up a sort of division between elections on the one hand, and you say, oh, that's democracy, and then basic rights or rule of law, that is just liberalism, I think that fails to see, and I guess here I'm sort of, again, maybe echoing Habermas for some of your viewers who are familiar with these theories in particular, that actually no, I mean, we cannot really think elections without basic democratic rights. I mean, elections are not just, okay, you know, on the day, everybody sort of registers a sort of brute kind of political preference. It's a process which is crucially going to involve people making claims, speaking up, assembling, associating. If you don't have freedom of assembly, if you don't have freedom of association, including real freedom for political parties, if you don't have, you know, chances to articulate your platforms, your objections to a government, and so on and so forth, then, and I can't believe I have to say this because it's in a sense, it's in a sense very obvious, then you're not going to have a free and fair election. And this is, of course, what has happened in many countries, that the leaders say, oh, but look, we still have elections and we're not hindering anybody on the day to vote and so on. But overall, the basic democratic rights have been hollowed out, and some people are systematically denied the real exercise of these basic democratic rights. And furthermore, but this is already, of course, a little bit more controversial for some people, you might say that if we don't have functioning independent courts to actually guarantee the exercise of these basic rights, then we also are going to have a problem. Then also we're going to have a real difficulty with anything like free and fair elections. Last remark, because I think this is less often pointed out. Nowhere in the world today do we actually have sort of examples of one or the other existing in some kind of pure form. We don't have a country where you would say, it's a real democracy, but you know what? It has no real rule of law. It doesn't exist. And by the same token, we don't have a country where you could say, oh, it's really liberal. It, you know, if you are inclined to think that way, it really genuinely guarantees the rule of law. You know, citizens can really sort of rely on their rights in a proper fashion. You know, some people might say, oh, maybe Singapore gets close in certain ways. But if you really think about it, these sort of models don't really exist. And maybe there's a reason why they don't really exist today, but also if you go back in history, you know, when people are sometimes saying, oh, but, you know, what about certain periods in the 19th century? Didn't you have actually a kind of pure rule of law? I think, you know, these arguments are also really difficult to ultimately make good on. So that will be my short answer to a complicated and difficult question.
Great. Well, another complicated question. Authors like Rovira Calwasser argue that populism in some circumstances, in some cases, might act as a corrective for democracy. That's also a very common thesis that you strongly reject. Again, can you tell us why don't you think that, at least in some contexts, and perhaps not all things considered, but might have some positive points. For example, Rovira Calwasser claims that in some Latin American countries, populist leaders introduced some interesting ideas or helped that traditional excluded sectors of the population started forming part of the real people. You nonetheless say that no, that populism is not a corrective for democracy in any way. Can you elaborate a bit on this idea?
Yeah, so I would simply underline that very often when people use populism in a positive sense, we actually have concepts that might capture what they are trying to refer to in a more precise fashion. So if we really are talking about democratic inclusion, call it democratic inclusion. If you want to talk about popular mobilization, call it popular mobilization. If we talk about, as often happens in the American context, something like defending Main Street against Wall Street, doing something for the lower income strata, whatever, however you want to describe it, why not simply call it social democracy or socialism or something that is less likely to lead to a situation where people end up saying, oh, both Bernie Sanders and Trump are populists. I think that is harmful for our ability to come to political judgments, understand where the important differences might be. And it would, I think, would help us not to sort of end up putting people into the same category when they really don't belong in the same category. If I may, let me add one other aspect, because this is also sometimes, I think, maybe misunderstood. Just because you end up saying that a party, a movement, a leader, or even a regime is populist, it doesn't follow that therefore everything that, let's say, a populist leader has ever said or advocated is nefarious or couldn't possibly be true. I mean, some of our colleagues sort of have an understanding of populism that it's sort of simplistic or inherently demagogic, or all these people are lying and so on. I'm not saying that. So for me, it would be strange if somebody denied that, for instance, maybe, God forbid, someone like Chavez had a point when he said, well, Venezuela is not exactly a very egalitarian, very inclusive kind of or Morales, or take your pick of, one of the Latin American populists that Cristobal and Cas would see as positive examples. So I'm not saying that, oh, we should think of these people as, they always were lying, or they always sort of did the wrong thing. Or a different example, of course, someone on one, like Erdogan, on one level had a point when he said, look, Turkey, is far away from certain democratic ideals of inclusiveness, because there's a particular kind of Kemalist elite. There are parts of the country which are neglected, who don't really have a voice, and so on. So obviously that might seem a little bit simplistic, like here's the good content and here are the sort of the bad leaders. I understand that. I'm just trying to add that, it doesn't follow from my approach that you can then simply say, oh, we never have to listen to what any of these people say or what they said at the beginning, and so on.
Great. So to unite the two topics discussion and briefly touch on another common topic, what's your take on the relationship between nationalism and populism? They are just the same thing, for example, as Biroli has sometimes claimed, that they are just the two faces of the same coin. Do you agree with this kind of ideas?
So from within my theoretical framework, again, maybe you find something worthwhile in it, maybe not. There are certainly elective affinities, but these are not the same concepts. And in general, I think it's become problematic that because we are constantly told that supposedly we live in the age of populism, we're sometimes, I think, too quick to kind of put the label of populism on phenomena for which we do have much more precise concepts, be it nationalism, racism, protectionism, whatever. So what's the difference? Well, populism, in my view, is a claim about a particular relationship of representation. So the leader or the party says only we represent the real people. Of course, they have to explain who the real people are. They have to offer a concrete symbolic construction. So it's not an accident that in our era, many right-wing populists in particular are going to reach for a particular understanding of the nation. And they're also going to valorize the nation in a particular, you might say, moralistic way. But you can make moral claims about the nation in the way that David Miller, for instance, does. We talked about him earlier. So he has, in a sense, a moral theory of the nation, that the nation really generates particular moral obligations for co-nationals. But that's completely separate from any sort of claim about representation. And none of the things I was trying to articulate earlier in relation to populism sort of necessarily has to be part of that, that package. So long story short, if you find anything maybe useful in my approach, it's worth maybe emphasizing that it says nothing about particular policy positions. So if you tell me what you think about the Euro crisis or about immigration or about trade deals or whatever, I, at least from within my framework, I could not say, oh, you are or you aren't a populist. There might be many other terms that might come to mind in terms of characterizing certain policy positions, but I wouldn't say, oh, something is sort of populist as such. Of course, others disagree. Others have been trying to sell us populism as, especially national populism. So think back to, Stephen Bannon, who at one point, was sort of always built up as he's going to come to Europe and he will change everything. And he himself would say, oh, my ideology is national populism because that's good for national workers and so on. But never mind, the details of that program. I would say no. You can actually clearly distinguish these particular phenomena.
Great. So to finish, in your text about populism, you also pondered briefly about how to confront it. Could you tell us the main ideas that you propose in this regard?
So I'm glad that I now have about 5 hours left to address this very simple question. I'll limit myself to perhaps first saying something about what I take to be the most common mistakes in how we think about this.
Right.
And if we can avoid the mistakes, I think that's already a significant advance, even if we don't have the kind of perfect 10 bullet points, oh, all you have to do is X, Y, Z. So I would say that it certainly is a mistake to put yourself in the position where you oddly end up mirroring populists. How so? Well, if your strategy is, okay, we're going to completely exclude them on all issues, we're never even going to talk to them. Populists, in a sense, have a very easy time to say, oh, look, these liberal Democrats, they're against exclusion, but they're excluding us. And what's even worse, it sort of confirms the narrative, which they always present to their followers, right? So they're going to say, look, these arrogant elites, they never listen to you and they don't care, or they don't have no arguments because of course we're right, and so on. It doesn't follow that one should go to the other extreme and basically say, oh, we can treat them like any other political formation and there's sort of no problem with what they're doing, and we can have all kinds of coalitions and basically kind of normalize them in a certain way. Talking with populists doesn't mean you have to talk like populists. So one thing, and that really is the other extreme, that has happened very often in the European context, is that eventually other parties decide that, okay, what they're saying basically does represent something true, something important, something overlooked about our societies. So very often politicians go from saying, oh, everything they say is demagogic, is a lie, we don't believe a word. They go to the other extreme of saying, oh, let's say far-right populist parties are telling us the truth about society. And what could that truth be? Well, for instance, that allegedly workers don't like foreigners. And that's why they don't like liberalized social democratic parties, which are too open to immigration. Hence, that's why they've all gone to the far right. And we just going to have to learn that and basically have to do what Danish social democrats have done and plenty of other formations are doing when they de facto end up mainstreaming the far right. I think that's also a mistake. First of all, you kind of erase all the normatively problematic aspects of populism. You don't any longer maybe say that, look, this kind of anti-pluralism is inherently dangerous for democracy. And maybe less obviously, I think you misunderstand how democratic representation actually works. It's, of course, always a mediated dynamic process. And it's not true that the election of one particular party ever sort of in an objective one-to-one way tells us something about, oh, now these are people's truest identities, or here are their objective interests, and so on. Again, I'm not saying that, you know, oh, everything the populists are saying is made up, or they can do, you know, they can just sort of put words into people's mouths. But the tendency has been so strong to basically say, oh, Trump clearly showed that, you know, the following is true of, to use the most cliched example, you know, so-called white working class people in the Midwest, or, you know, the example I gave about workers in Europe earlier. As a number of people, I'm not the first to say this for sure, have pointed out, look, social democratic parties have lost a lot more voters to green parties, and a lot of them have also basically ended up in a situation where people who used to vote for them no longer vote at all. They've basically checked out of the political system entirely. I mean, this is something that, for instance, just as one example, Piketty has rightly pointed out. He said, look, if it was really so simple that, oh, workers just, you know, they love far-right parties, this is their deepest desire, then this would be a golden age for participation by certain strata of the population. But of course, the numbers show something very different. So I think that's a really important mistake to avoid, and it's the more likely mistake, I think, at this point. So what is there left by way of something somewhat more constructive, you know, beyond simply saying don't do this, don't do that? My contribution would simply be to say you've got to, in a sense, be ready for real conflict. That's what it means to really engage with these parties and figures. You have to be able, within a conflict, to find the line between normal policy disagreement, where, you know, what the other side says you really might find very objectionable, but you might ultimately have to concede that it's something that can be said within a democratic context. So if somebody, for instance, says, you know, I want much less immigration, wouldn't be my position, but I would hesitate, to put it mildly, to say that, oh, you can never say this in a democracy. This is in and of itself a completely unacceptable policy position. But if somebody performs the maneuver I was trying to point to earlier, in terms of, oh, only some people are the real people, and we are going to basically incite hatred against minorities, which sooner or later is actually going to trickle down into real world aggression against these minorities, let alone if you engage in conspiracy theories. I mean, all these sorts of things which come with this anti-pluralist package, then it's supremely important that other politicians don't treat this as, oh, that's just sort of part of the normal game, but they signal to audiences, no, this is something different. And please understand the difference. And even if you like some of the policy positions of these populist parties, understand the danger and understand what you are really going along with and what consequences it might ultimately have. This is not easy, obviously. This is more an art than a science. It's a problem that actually many professionals are confronting. It's also a challenge for journalists, for instance. At what point do you come out and say officially, look, this is no longer about a policy disagreement with Trump. This is how Trump is dangerous for democracy. Obviously, that's a very tough thing to pull off, because Trump loves nothing more than to be able to say, look, you know, the press is the opposition, it's partisan, I can always discredit them because they simply don't like me because of, you know, my policy positions and so on. So I think that's a very, very difficult challenge. We don't really have sort of larger political theories which would sort of help us how to get a more nuanced understanding of how to do this. But I think it's absolutely vital that politicians do this well. And as I was trying to say, also other professionals, including journalists, lawyers, people who teach, I think sooner or later might be confronted with situations where they have to make it plausible where exactly that line runs.
Great, Professor Müller, thank you very much for your time. We will continue reading your work with interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me on your program, so to speak.